It's Jelly! So Jojo Day is almost here, and I really hope that it will be a Steel Ball Run anime announcement, but I think it's the perfect time to show you how I made my Johnny Joestar cosplay from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And also, you can have all my patterns as reference for free, so hopefully I can guide you from getting from this to this. So I feel like I should preface this by saying that a lot of JoJo's designs are notoriously a bit inconsistent. Even in Steel Ball Run's comic, Johnny goes from having tiny short sleeves to double short sleeves, to from feather to no feather, differing stripe patterns on a shirt, and that's not even getting into the whole color situation. Well, Araki hasn't even specified a canon color palette yet. And that's not even taking into account the games and the other appearances. So I'm just picking whatever I want, which just happens to be the English color translated manga, his all-star battle outfit, and also this specific MMD. And also, I just really wanted like a comfy cosplay, so kind of going for a more pajama-like cosplay. Going from top to bottom, he is wearing a beanie. I thought for a long time if I wanted to make the material less modern looking, but I do like the look of a classic beanie with rib knit fabric, so I'll be using that. And the stars all over the cosplay will be made with pink short pile fur, because it's fluffy. The horseshoe I plan to make with EVA foam, and the horse can be a full leather scrap. The feather I plan to make with fabric, because what bird is that even supposed to be? And some wire I had laying around. Okay, so the main part of his shirt I decided to make with stretch faux suede. I chose faux suede because even though it's not exactly period accurate, it would look less modern than say like sweatshirt or t-shirt fabric. The purple can be flannel, and the same fur for the pink stars, and black straps of faux leather. And you can probably start to see a pattern here. Pants will have the same blue and pink fabrics from the shirt, so will the boot covers. The racers, however, I want to be gold, so they'll use the same pink fur and black faux leather, but also a gold chrome mirror vinyl. Spurs I plan to make with EVA foam and Warbler, and the little stars on his hands are just temporary tattoo paper. And I think that's just about it. Oh yeah, I'm making a Tusk plush too. This is his stand in the manga, and I think it will be the perfect little prop. I'll be using the pink fur and the gold vinyl for it, as well as a little bit of felt for the details. All my patterns are self-drafted, and I will include a link in the description. It is in my size, so if you're a similar build to me, it should fit you, but if not, hopefully it gives you a good starting point for your own pattern. Since it's made out of stretchy fabric as well, fit is not super important, so you could probably scale the pattern up and down, or also cut in and out of the seam allowances. So this video will cover the shirt, the pants, and the hat of the cosplay. But there will be a part 2 video later to show you the rest, like the bracers, the boot covers, the spurs, and whatnot. And of course. Now let's get to making the cosplay. So if you ever look at a shirt, there's typically 4 parts. So there's the front panel, the back, and the 2 sleeves, which are the same pattern. And then we're going to add a hood, which is 1 panel on either side of your head. And then also a purple collar, which is essentially a long purple rectangle that's sewn into the collar. And then finally, the little purple heart on the sleeve and a double sleeve. So essentially the same pattern but slightly longer. And I can't quite tell if the purple pieces are an undershirt or just a second layer to his shirt. But I'm just going to sew them all together into his main shirt just because I think it'll be easier and also cheaper. Generally, I think it's better in cosplay to sew things together anyway, just so there's no chance of things slipping around. First, I couldn't quite find the right colored fabric I wanted when I was shopping, so I had to dye it myself. I just took white knit ribbed fabric for the beanie and the stretch faux suede and cut it to more manageable pieces, washed it, and dyed it with Rit Dymore, synthetic Kentucky Sky, and regular Rit Indigo. I used the whole bottle of the Kentucky Sky in 2.5 gallons of water and added 2 splashes of indigo. I actually messed up a little here. Typically, when you dye synthetic fabrics, which these are, you need to keep the mixture of water and dye boiling while you dye it. I didn't have a big enough pot, so I just boiled water on the stove and poured it into a bucket with the fabric and kept it off the heat. Honestly, it kind of worked out. The color didn't take that much since it wasn't the right temperature the whole time, but I wanted it to be a light color anyway, so that's why I added an entire bottle of synthetic dye and a splash of indigo to just add a little bit more pigment. And I kept it in the dye for about 30 minutes. And also, remember not to dye fabric within pots that you're actually cooking with. Then I washed out the fabric and got this lovely pastel blue. And now for the stars. Yes, It was very repetitive and tiring, and if you don't want to go through this torture, go get yourself some paint or something so you don't have to cut stars out of fabric. Typically, fur fabric cutting is more delicate than this, and you use either a blade or you cut very carefully along the backing. But like, who cares? I'm making like 100 of them. Starting with the sleeve. You only need like 6 stars to a sleeve, but you might as well cut them out for later. So first I drew a 1/4 inch outline around the heart, and this will be the seam allowance and lets me know where I can put the stars. After that, I used the wash away basting tape, which is actually one of my favorite sewing tools and is essentially a really low tack tape which can temporarily hold fabric together. Then I sewed them onto the purple fabric with just a straight stitch because I didn't want to do a traditional applique zigzag stitch for every single star since there's so many. Also, this fabric doesn't fray. The fastest way to do it is to go around the border of each star, pick up the pressure foot, move the fabric over, and just continuing sewing on the next star. Then at the end, cut all the threads, but don't forget the back stitch for every single star. Then I added the edge fabric of the heart to make it 3D. It's just a 1-inch strip of purple fabric, which I clipped in place and then marked the endpoint of the heart with a heat erase marker so I know where to start sewing. Going slowly around, I just keep slowly repositioning the strip of fabric so that the edge aligns with the edge of the heart. And then once I get close to the corner of the heart, I mark it, sew to the line, and then clip the strip, which is just the top fabric. Really close to the needle. And then I repositioned it with an owl and then sew the rest of the way around with the same method. Once I get to the end, I just move the beginning of the strip out of my way and sew right up to the starting point with a mark as my guide. I just sew both ends of the strip together at the end of the heart. After, I clip a triangle out of the corner, the extra strip of fabric, and then around the seam allowance. This allows me to flip everything over nicely. Then to give it some 3D structure, I'm adding 2 layers of a 1/4 inch fusible foam. They both have one side that has heat activated adhesive, and those sides will be facing the fabric of the heart and the outside to be attached to the sleeve later on. So once you add the first layer of foam and iron it, the fabric is stuck to the foam. Then I just added the last piece of foam and roughly sewed the fabric over it so that no frayed edges would show once it's attached to the shirt. I put some basting tape on the heart to hold it to the shirt as it's being ironed, but I think you can get away with not using it. And lastly, I did a ladder stitch between the 2 layers of the fabric to lock down the edges of the heart. Basically, it's a hand stitch that's really close to the edge of the purple heart and the blue fabric. And you should be able to see how sturdy and invisible the stitch is at the end compared to how it started. So now, the heart sleeve piece is done and we can move on to the hood. The hood needs 4 pieces, 2 on either side of the head and then 2 for the lining. The outer layer, I added some lightweight fusible interfacing so it sits stiffer when you wear it. Every time I'm going to be sewing a stretch fabric to another stretch fabric, I'm going to need the seam to stretch a little bit. So I'm going to be using a stretch stitch, but alternatively, you could also use a zigzag. You can use either stitch, but I like the look of the stretch stitch better because it's narrower, and with a zigzag stitch, sometimes the seam can look a bit gappy if you don't adjust the settings to reduce the size of the zigzag. Also, stretch fabric can be annoying to sew, but if you have a ballpoint, a jersey, or a stretch needle, or even a walking foot, it should make it easier. I'm using a stretch needle while sewing, and you also may need to dial in the tension settings of your machine. Going back to the lining of the hood, I sewed around the back seam and again at the front seam. Then I trimmed off the excess seam allowance and did the same to the outer layer of the hood. Once they're both done, you can stuff the lining into the outer layer, making sure that the seam allowances are opposite to each other, and then sew around the lining of the hood. Then I flipped it inside out and pinned the seam allowance to the lining layer, and so I can understitch it to the lining. And that keeps it from flopping forward and makes our seam more neat on the outside. And then I just stitched the 2 layers of the hood together on the bottom after I turned it right side out. On to the body and sleeve. And a note about the sleeve patterns, it's good to note where the front side is, since they look very similar from the back, but it is not the same. Then there is the front and back of the shirt, which is cut on the fold, so symmetric on both sides. And then something optional I did to prevent the fabric from stretching unnecessarily when I was sewing was stay stitch the curved parts, aka like add a straight seam, onto the sleeve and armholes of the front and back. And this makes your seam neater at the end, but you will need to unpick it and remove these seams later. Between the front and the back piece, I sewed the tops of the shoulders and the sides together, and I trimmed off the excess. Okay, and then here I actually bothered to finish the seam with an overlock stitch. An overlock stitch can be done with a variety of stitches, like these ones, if you don't have a serger. And basically they're just there to prevent the fabric from fraying at the edges, but technically the stretch suede fabric doesn't fray, so you don't really need to overlock it. But I do think it is good practice, and especially for the woven fabrics that do fray a lot, like the flannel. But I cannot guarantee that I actually did overlock all my seams on this project. Anyway, for the sleeves, I sewed the sides together, clipped the extra seam allowance to roughly 1/4 of an inch, and then finished with an overlock stitch. Then I folded the shirt hem over twice and sewed it in place. For the purple sleeve, it's basically the exact same, and you can do the same steps. Then I stuffed the purple sleeve into the blue, making sure the fronts are aligned and that the right side of the purple fabric touches the wrong side of the blue fabric, and I clipped them together to sew. I sewed within the seam allowance and then unpicked the stay stitches so that they wouldn't show up later when we actually sew it to the front and back pieces. Next, I sewed the sleeves onto the body pieces, and you should know the next steps from here. And then I attached the hood to the collar of the shirt. And now for the little purple piece he has in his collar, I took a rectangle of purple flannel and I sewed it into a loop. Then I attached one edge to the edge of the collar, making sure that the wrong side of the fabric is facing outward, because after attaching the purple collar and the shirt together, I folded the purple piece over to form a nice clean edge, and then one more time. And basically we're making a giant bias binding to encase the raw seam of the shirt in the purple fabric, which is also our collar. I left a little bit of a lip on the outside, since my first sewing line wasn't that good, and you could still see the shirt seam, which I wanted to cover. Then I did a ladder stitch between the outside edge through the blue fabric, and then to the inside edge of the purple fabric. And the seam should look super clean on both sides at the end. Finally, for the hem, I just folded the fabric twice and then top stitched that down. And the shirt is almost done. Just need to add a few strap details. Here is a reference for where I pinned my straps on the shirt along with the shoulder seam, then at the side seam. I also found that this pleather didn't take to the iron very well, so I just used the basting tape again to hold down the edges. More tape can be used to really tack down the straps, but you can just use pins as well. Also, don't worry, it doesn't gunk up your machine, and you can just sew right through it. Once I had the vertical and horizontal straps in, I sewed on both sides of each strap, starting from the vertical ones, and then working my way to the horizontal one across the chest. And at the end of the chest strap, I just folded it over and sewed it down as well. I After sewing one of the top stitches on the horizontal strap, I peeled up the vertical straps underneath and trimmed them so that the ends were hidden. And then I sewed down the horizontal strap. And it's done! So the pants pattern is super simple, just 2 front pieces that are mirrored and then 2 back pieces that are mirrored. And then they're going to be fully elasticated, you just pull them on, no zipper. So about the stars, I used 100 on the pants, so that's 25 stars per pants pattern, which is a lot of tape if I used the previous method. But I do have an alternative. After cutting out all the stars, I stuck them into some cardboard with tape with the fur side down. I had used a heat erasable marker, so I just hovered an iron over them to get rid of the marks. And then I hit it with a Quilter's basting spray, and this should leave a little bit of adhesive on the back of the stars. I marked the hemline on the pants, and I stuck all of the stars on like a sticker. And then I sewed all of them on, just like the heart stars. Before the rest of the tutorial, I just want to say I did add pockets to the pants. Yeah, a really good move for future me at conventions. But unfortunately for future me, I also cut them off. Hold on, I have a reason. I noticed that the pockets kind of caused a really weird bulge in the pants since the fabric was so thin on top. And I really couldn't deal with it. So if you see pockets in the footage, ignore them, but feel free to add them to your own pants, especially if you have thicker fabric, but just be warned. Anyway, first step is to sew the crotches together of the front pieces and the back pieces. Then sew up the outer sides and the inner sides of the leg. Then fold it over the waistband area to sew a tube, leaving a gap of roughly 2 inches so that I can thread in the elastic later. I use the bodkin, but you can use a safety pin as well to help pull the elastic through. Just make sure it's flat in the tube and sew the elastic together. I use a zigzag stitch here. And then make sure the hole is closed and finished off the folded over hem at the bottom of the pant leg. And the pants are done! Now for the hat. The hat will have one detachable horseshoe and then have the same pattern repeated 4 times. One for the front, one for the back, and then 2 more for lining layers. The horseshoe is made of 2mm EVA foam. I cut the first piece out, then the second I just drew the outline on another sheet of foam. Then made 2 little rectangular tabs to add some depth on the top of the horseshoe. Everything is contact cemented together, making sure to use a respirator and have ventilation where you're working. I then cut through the last layer of foam for that nice flush edge. I heat sealed the EVA foam surface with a heat gun. Oh, and wear a respirator as well. And you know when you're done when the surface goes from matte to having a slight sheen on it. I then primed it with 3 layers of Cosflex, which is pretty similar to Flex Bond, letting each layer dry fully in between. I actually dilute it with some water to prevent it from getting too thick and retaining the brush strokes. And then I hit it with some gold spray paint, and this one is my fave. And when it's dry, contact cement some Velcro on there. For the horse in front of his beanie, I just cut it out with some scissors out of some faux leather, including the eyes and nose. For the beanie outer fabric, I marked the top and bottom seam lines, and this just makes it easier for me to know where to start and stop stitching later, and where I should put the stars. To sew the lining together, I sewed from the edges to the tops of the bumps. Then I pitched the center of both sides of fabric and I pulled the sewed pieces flat. and I can sew the remaining seams between the 2 bumps. It looks pretty close to a beanie once you flip it inside out. Then attach all the stars to the outer layer of the hat, and this is sounding pretty familiar now. I added 33 stars and made sure to leave some space for the horse as well. Then it's time for more top stitching for the stars and the horse, and the 2 little pieces of Velcro for the horseshoe. The outer layers of the beanie are sewed just like the lining, and then the 2 pieces can be attached at the edge, leaving a gap to flip inside out later. Once it's flipped, ladder stitch the gap closed and make a top stitch. And it's done! It also has holes for his hair, but I'll cut them later when I make the wig. So that's the beanie, the shirt, and the pants. And I think this video is long enough already. But even though the cosplay's not done yet, let's talk stats so far. So far, I have used 139 stars on this cosplay. I've crafted a total of 54 hours, though 24 of those were patterning, and if you were to use my patterns, you wouldn't do that. Here's a breakdown of the remaining 30 hours, 6 on the hat, 9 on the pants, and 15 on the shirt, including things like cutting the fabric, machine sewing, hand sewing, and also sewing these damn stars. And it's 3 items checked off the cosplay list, so in the next video, I'll be going through the wig, the feathers, the hand tattoos, the bracers, tusk, the boot covers, and the spurs. This is already a lot to go through and edit, and since it's been about 2 years since I made this cosplay, it's been a lot to remember as well, and I just never really got around to making a tutorial. Hopefully this is helpful and at least entertaining, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments so I can try to help you out. And if you use my tutorial to either make this cosplay or reference it for other projects, please tag me in it. I would love to see it. I'm on Insta as Jelly Cosplay, and you can also find some cute crafting and cosplay pics there. Oh, and of course, the patterns are in the description for free. And I think that's just about it. I mean, how do people end videos? Don't forget to